Hello, wonderful people, and welcome to the Epic of Eden, Understanding the Old Testament as Your Story. If we haven't met yet, my name is Sandra Richter. I'm a professor of Old Testament, and I am so excited and so grateful that you are here, joining me for this deep dive into the great story of God and His people. We as Christians, we want to understand our Bibles, don't we? We want to be able to put together the great story of redemption, catch a glimpse of what this book meant to its original authors and audience, and therefore what it should mean to us. This is our story, and we're eager to claim it. But when we attempt to study our Old Testament, we struggle, don't we? And that for a lot of reasons. But let me tell you, as someone who has taught Bible to everyone from the toddler church of St. Pat's Anglican to the doctoral students at the London School of Theology, I'm convinced that there really are only three controlling issues that make us shy away from the study of our Old Testament. And my goal as your teacher over these next 12 weeks is to solve those issues. So what are they? Well, the first one, and the one that just breaks my heart, is that somewhere along the way, someone has taught the church that the Old Testament isn't their story. So most pick up the Bible at Matthew chapter 1, and they think they're good to go. That everything that comes before the New Testament is either ancient, and therefore irrelevant, history, or it speaks of the story of a God who is foreign to the New Covenant. Full disclosure, if we're going to be honest here, for most of us, our functional relationship with the Old Testament is that it is the unfortunate preface to the part of the Bible that really matters. Well, my ambition in this study is to shatter that erroneous perception, to unravel the myth, because it's not true. According to Galatians 3:29, when you were baptized into Christ, you became an heir of Abraham. And this is your story. And I won't be done with you until I find you weeping over Sarah's empty arms. And I find you in the crowd right along with Moses shouting, "Let my people go." This is your story. Okay, that's issue number one. Issue number two is something I call the Great Barrier. There is no question that the narratives in the Old Testament happened long, long ago and far, far away. The antiquity of the events is almost unfathomable. The geography is strange, the economy unrecognizable, and strangest of all is that to step into this book is to step into someone else's culture. So my job is to serve as your tour guide, to get you past the Great Barrier and back into the story. So we'll be working with a timeline and maps and a bit of ancient anthropology as well. It'll be fun, I promise. The third great challenge in studying this Old Testament of ours is something I have named the dysfunctional closet syndrome. In my mind, I'm picturing a closet, much like mine in college, where the clothes have slipped from their hangers, jackets and belts and bathing suits are overflowing from their designated shelves, and the floor is flooded with stuff you can't even identify. Have you ever been there? Would it stun you to find out that the typical Christian's knowledge of the Old Testament is much like that very messy closet, crammed full of names and dates and places that are all jumbled up on top of each other, and therefore impossible to use? My job as your Old Testament closet organizer is to pull out all of that stuff that you've memorized over the years, to get the random pieces up off the floor, put all those pieces in order, an order that makes sense and follows the theological trajectory of the biblical authors, add a few pieces here and there, and then get you a whole bunch of new rods and hangers and shelves and hooks so that you can use all the great stuff that you have. So this session, we're going to circle back to the Great Barrier, issue number 2. Specifically, the Great Barrier of culture. As any anthropologist will tell you, we as human beings, we tend to be blissfully unaware of our own culture. That is until we're exposed to someone else's culture. And then all of a sudden we realize the stuff we do, our standards of courtesy, if we do or do not greet strangers, if we make eye contact with cashiers, how close we stand to other people, the architectural style of our houses, the food we eat, our perception of beauty, or our perception of modesty, may not be normative to the entire human race. I know, staggering, isn't it? We call that very human tendency to assume that everyone else is mostly just like us, ethnocentrism. And know that this isn't just a Western thing or an American thing. This is a human thing. My job is to help you step past your ethnocentrism, your cultural norms, so that you can successfully step into the cultures of ancient Israel and encounter the very real people of the Old Testament according to their cultural norms. That's how we get these people off the flannel graph, if that means anything to you, and back into the real experiences of their very real faith, just like us. Know as well that there's another issue in the mix regarding ethnocentrism, something I call canonizing culture. I made that phrase up, so you're probably not going to find it in a dictionary. But this is that moment when we go beyond our ethnocentrism, naively assuming that everyone else is just like us, and we cross the line into bias, when we start assuming that our culture or their culture, our ideas on courtesy and polity and wardrobe, is somehow superior to someone else's. We don't want to do that. So let's have a little visual exercise with this idea. Are you ready? Take a look at your screen. Who is this person? Not a trick question. This is a famous image known as the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It's recognized internationally as the main character of the New Testament, and it's been used for generations for prayer, especially among the Catholics. But take a look at this man's hair. What color is that hair? Are you going to go with light brown? Light brown with some nice blonde highlights going on? Highlights that would have cost you good money down at the salon? How about his eyes? Blue with a touch of green, if you get close enough? Clearly a little recessive genes going on in there. And if you were to describe his skin, a bit Mediterranean? I'd probably go for Caucasian. And his build? Buff? Not so much. And what about those hands? Are those the hands of a manual laborer? Okay, let's take a look at another image. Do you recognize this guy? Yeah, right answer. This one is also Jesus. I like to call this guy the Irish Jesus because his hair is, yes, red. His eyes, aquamarine. His skin, oh my gosh, this guy would need SPF 30 just to get to the mailbox. And what about those hands? Now, guys, we know enough about the historical Jesus, the Jewish historical Jesus, to be able to predict his hair color. It's brown, moving toward black. His skin, Mediterranean olive. And after 3 years of itinerant preaching in the Galilean sun, oh my gosh, dark brown. We can also predict his height and his build. Based on the architecture of the day, he was likely about 5'4". An apprentice to his father, the tecton builder, as all good firstborns should be. Jesus would have spent his summers working construction. Think about that. So our Jesus should be dark, stocky, not terribly tall, and pretty darn buff. Yeah? His hands? Well, like most contractors' hands, they should have been rough, calloused, scarred, a purple nail or two, maybe even a finger missing. And yet here he is, completely recognizable, blonde and blue-eyed, and dressed in the garb of a Roman philosopher. So you might logically ask, how in the world did our first century Jewish Jesus become a pale, skinny white guy dressed in a Roman pallium? And the answer is because the guys who were painting him were pale, skinny white guys. and they might have been dressed in Roman garb as well. Now, obviously, historically, this is a problem. And I'm going to ask you to do better as we move through this curriculum. But I also want you to recognize that there's something kind of beautiful about this. Because what is happening here, and in so many other contexts, is that the artist is putting his face onto the face of Jesus. The artist is putting himself, herself, back into the story. And the fact that we as humans see the biblical characters as us, well, honestly, there's something very powerful in that. But if we're going to become true students of the Bible, we're going to have to push past that a bit. We're going to have to step beyond our ethnocentrism. We're going to have to see our Jesus as the first century Jew that he actually was. And we're going to have to see all the other biblical characters in that fashion as well. So let me show you a few more ethnocentric presentations. This one is the wedding supper in Cana of Galilee. I love this one because if the disciples actually showed up in those outfits, they would have been laughed out of town. How about this one? Coming from the historic Bright Hope Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Here we have an African-American Jesus. And once again, our artist, George McDowell, is putting the faces of his congregation onto the face of Jesus. And here's St. John's Episcopal in Memphis. Back in the 1950s, John Henry DeRozan retired to this community, and his gift to his church were these amazing murals. And their Jesus? Well, their Jesus is a Viking, buff and blonde and 6.5 feet tall. This is anything but what you would expect from a first century Jew. But again, an ethnocentric presentation of a Jesus who has become the reflection of the faces that are looking at him. Another favorite comes from the Cathedral of Cusco in Lima, Peru. Take a look at this image. You recognize the players, right? It's the Last Supper, also known as the Passover feast. All the right guys are there, right? Sitting around the table, clearly recognizable. But here's the rub. In Peru, they don't eat lamb for high holidays, as a Jew would on the Passover. And of course, Jesus has got to have a really special meal, right? So can you guess what the main course is here? Take a look. Up close. He's small. He's got 4 legs. He's tasty. He's a cooey. Yeah, known to my daughters as one of their favorite pets, a guinea pig. And if you come from Lima, Peru, he's a staple of any holiday meal. But he's also a rodent, something a first century rabbi would never consume, especially not on the Passover. But once again, the locals have put their traditions into the gospel story. This is ethnocentrism. So we're going to push past our guinea pigs and Roman palliums, our white, black, and Chinese presentations of Jesus, and we're going to do our very best to understand their culture, knowing that we're not going to canonize their culture, nor are we going to canonize ours, but we're going to do our very best to understand. Because in understanding ancient Israel's culture, we have taken an enormous step across the Great Barrier. We have stepped into the space of real people who lived in real places and exercised real faith. Okay, so what kind of culture did ancient Israel have? It's likely best to start our journey by knowing a little bit more about our own Western, American, European culture in the 21st century. And to know that our culture is largely bureaucratic. That means that we are a state-based culture. It is the state that controls our legal system and provides economic opportunity. It also means that it is the state that cares for the disenfranchised. So if you and your spouse were to, God forbid, lose your jobs next Monday morning, the first thing you would do in our culture is file for unemployment. Yep. And if it got really bad, you might wind up down at the Department of Social Services, applying for SNAP, DSNAP, or WIC, formerly known as food stamps. or looking into Medicaid or Medicare, or utility or rent assistance. We have a safety net in our bureaucratic culture provided by the state to care for the marginalized. And what about if you went racing down the highway at 85 miles an hour in your brand new shiny Prius or totally loaded Ford Maverick pickup truck, and you saw blue flashing lights behind you? You would know that a representative of the state was holding you accountable for breaking the laws of the state. And he would stand at your window and he would ask for certification that confirmed that you were a citizen in right standing with the state. Guys, this is a bureaucratic society. This is how we run things. Israel's culture, in contrast, was a tribal society, a traditional culture, a society where the state is not the axis of the community. Rather, the axis of a tribal society is the family. It is the kinsmen who care for the kinsmen, and kinsmen who hold kinsmen accountable. So if you were racing down the national highway on your souped-up Camel at a raging 40 miles an hour and you trampled a neighbor's chickens, that neighbor would not call the cops. That neighbor would call your dad. And your dad would beat the snot out of you. You've read the book of Proverbs, haven't you? And if your dad was not effective at curbing your reckless behavior, well, he'd call your uncles. And if your uncles couldn't get an appropriate response out of you, they would march you down to the city gate in your little village of 150 souls, where you would answer for your behavior before the elders of the village. Deuteronomy 21. And you need to know that those are real elders. They are relatives of your little Iron Age village. And you can be certain sure that they will discipline the stubborn and rebellious son. And what about that safety net? Well, in ancient Israel, it was also the family that provided the safety net. So if a family member fell on hard times, it would be a kinsman who stepped in to assist. Take a look at this diagram that offers us a schematic of the structure of Israelite society. The core of their tribal society is the patriarch and his bet av. And that's because Israel was not only a tribal society, they were a patriarchal tribal society. So the bet av, a term you will come to know and love, is Hebrew for the father's household. This was the building block of their society. And whereas in our world, we would expect a household to include a mom and a dad and 2.5 kids in the burbs, in a house way bigger than anyone actually needs, that's not Israel. Rather, an Israelite, bet av, included the oldest living male, that's the patriarch, his wife, perhaps his widowed mother, his unmarried daughters, his sons, their wives, and their children. 2 to 3 generations, as few as 6, as many as 20 persons in all, living in a family compound piled on top of each other. The next level is the clan, or lineage. All cousins of one sort or another that make up the fabric of the local village. And then outside of that, the tribe. Yes, biblical Israel is literally made up of 12 tribes. And if you were thinking the Sioux, the Cherokee, the Chumash, well, you're thinking right. When collected, these tribes embodied the nation. And if you were to distill this culture down into 3 words, well, those words would be patriarchal, patrilineal, and patrilocal, with the word patra communicating the male-centered focus of this society. So let's take a look at that first word, patriarchal. This has to do with authority and the idea that all authority, and therefore all responsibility, within this extended family lands on the oldest living male. In this world, the patriarch stands responsible for every member of his household. He holds the fiduciary responsibility for their assets and for their behavior. It was his job to protect and defend his kinsmen, to train his firstborn, and to discipline the ne'er-do-well. If someone fell on hard times, it was the patriarch who put his own resources on the line for their well-being. If the family fell on hard times, it was the patriarch who made the decision to apprentice a son outside the home, or worse, to sell one child so that the others might have the food they needed to survive. He arranged all the marriages. This is the father's household, and the responsibility and authority for this household rests on this man's shoulders. There's a story coming out of your Bible that dramatically illustrates these dynamics. It's the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis chapter 38. But before we launch into that narrative, let me share another detail of Israel's traditional society, and that is the role of women. In Israel's patriarchal society, a woman's link to the legal and economic structures of her world was through the men in her life. She was born her father's daughter. She became her husband's wife. She moves from her Bet Av into his, and if blessed, she will eventually become her son's mother. This does not mean that the women of Israel's world were without power. You have met Sarah and Rebecca, Leah and Deborah. These women were tough, and they knew how to get their men to do what they wanted. But in the patriarchal system, things had to happen through her men. So if a woman winds up widowed prior to producing children, she's in trouble. This is why your Bible is constantly calling on us to care for the widow and the orphan, because these people fall outside the Bet Av, which means they fall outside the safety net that their society has to offer. So back to Genesis 38. Here Judah, one of the 12 patriarchs of the tribes of Israel, has married his eldest son to a certain Tamar. But Judah's eldest son dies prematurely, leaving Tamar no longer a member of her biological father's house, but no longer connected to her husband's father's house either. According to Israelite law, the way we fix this is that Judah is supposed to offer this girl in marriage to his second son. The idea is that she would then be able to legally remain in her father-in-law's household, as she would now be married to his second son. This keeps a roof over her head and continues to offer her the potential of children. This marriage arrangement is called the levirate law, in that the brother, the levir in Latin, marries his deceased brother's wife. Is she his first wife? Likely not. But the firstborn child of this levirate union will belong to the dead brother, inheriting the dead brother's resources. And all the following children will belong to the living husband. So let's pick up our second term, another piece of data that will help us understand Tamar's story. Patrilineal. Patrilinealism is the societal expectation that all inheritance, land and children being the most valuable, move through the male line. Now, you kind of already knew this because you've already seen Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 and maybe even Genesis 10, where the genealogies of the Bible only record the names of the men. Have you ever wondered about that? Well, I can guarantee you that the members of your second grade Sunday school class, they've wondered about it. Hey, teacher, who did Adam's sons marry? There weren't any girls. Yeah, well, it's not that the girls weren't there. It's that the girls weren't recorded. And that because the reason we have genealogies is to record who goes where and who gets what inheritance. And those questions don't involve women. In fact, the only time we should expect a woman in a genealogy is if a man had multiple wives, a luxury typically only wealthy men could afford. So a king would have many wives. Abraham had several wives, and those wives are recorded. But generally, women are not recorded in the genealogies because the women don't inherit. That is, unless your biblical writer has something they want to say. So open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1 and take a look at the most significant genealogy in the Bible, the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And note that in that genealogy, there are 5 women named. I said 5. What are they doing there? Well, one, of course, is Mary, and the reason for her inclusion is obvious. But what about the rest? Ruth, the Moabitess, the despised foreigner. What is she doing there? How about Rahab, the madam, who ran a brothel in the city of Jericho? Or Bathsheba, still identified in Matthew 1 as Uriah's wife, the most famous adulteress of all time. And then there's our hero, Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law. Guys, these women shouldn't be in any genealogy, let alone one that records the line of the promised one, which means that your biblical author has something to say. In point of fact, in violating his own cultural norms, the author of Matthew chapter 1 is shouting at us, shouting that in this new covenant, all are welcome. Outsiders, sinners, foreigners, women with a reputation, accepted into this new lineage that Jesus is birthing right here, right now. A new lineage where there will be neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. Welcome in the genealogy of the Christ. And these women stand right there on the page announcing to us that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. And if you did not know the societal norms of Israel, you would miss it. 2 last details about Israel's patrilineal culture before we shut this first session down. 1, know that the firstborn son is unique within the family system because he will one day become the patriarch himself. And 2, land. Let's start with land. In Israel, land can only be transferred via inheritance. This because the Israelite understood that every parcel of the promised land had been distributed by God to the 12 tribes, every field, every creek, every hillside, and each tribe passed it on to their descendants. So land must never move outside its designated family system. And the only reason anyone would ever think about selling their land is if they were on the absolute brink of economic disaster. And even then, there is this law in Leviticus 25 named the Inalienable Land Law that requires a kinsman to step up and buy the land of his impoverished relative back on his behalf. Now, if that wasn't possible, then the one who purchased the land had to be willing to sell it back to the one he purchased it from without interest when the original owner had recovered his assets. And if that couldn't happen, well, then there is the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, every parcel of land returned to its original owner, and everyone got to start over again. This is how Israel protected their society against the cycle of perpetual poverty. And although the system, again, seems odd to us, generally it worked. Are we going to canonize this culture? No, but we are going to try to understand it. Okay, second point, the firstborn. According to Deuteronomy 21:17, the firstborn son inherits twice as much as his brothers. Hey, try that out in the average American home. The idea was that the firstborn, because he was destined to be the patriarch himself one day, he would need the resources necessary to care for the Bet Av. As a result of this unique role, the firstborn served as something akin to his father's apprentice, always pulling double duty, always living under a higher standard, but also living with that greater promise. And most of you firstborns out there, well, you still live with some of that, especially the double duty part. But pertinent to our earlier point, God doesn't always attend to these cultural expectations. Rather, we find in the story of Esau and Jacob that God chooses the younger brother. Hey, that's not right. And how about David? King David is chosen over 7 of his brothers. Man, in a patrilineal society, an 8th-born son is going to get a granola bar and a pat on the back. But God gives David the kingdom. Why? Well, in both of these cases, because God doesn't see things quite the way people do. For Samuel 16, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I point this out because I want you to keep in mind that the gospel critiques every culture. God has indeed revealed himself through Israel's culture, but that doesn't mean he's canonizing it, nor is he canonizing ours. Alrighty, team. This brings us to the end of session 1. Get that homework done in the study guide. I can't wait to see you next time.